The impossible happened in the Pacific War. A Japanese pilot delivered his nation's most feared fighter straight into American hands. On June 4, 1942, a crash in the Aleutian Islands cracked the myth of the invincibility of the Mitsubishi Zero. What was pulled from the mud exposed the aircraft's secrets and changed how the air war was fought. Let's kill a myth right now. Tadayoshi Koga did not defect. He did not surrender his aircraft. This was an accident that became an intelligence windfall. During the Dutch harbor raid, Koga's Mitsubishi Zero was hit. Anti-aircraft fire damaged his fuel system or controls. He made a forced landing on Aleutian Island. Remote. Nothing but tundra and rock. The soft mud cushioned the impact, but the rough ground flipped the aircraft. Tadayoshi Koga, born September 10, 1922, was killed instantly. He was only 19 years old. The Zero remained largely intact. Upside down. Buried in mud. Waiting for someone to find it, and for over a month, nobody knew it was there until a routine patrol stumbled onto something that would change everything. July 11, 1942. Lieutenant William Bill Thies was flying a PBY-5A Catalina on patrol when he spotted wreckage in the mud. Japanese markings. And it looked intact. Thies didn't just file a report and move on. He persuaded his commanders that this wasn't just another wrecked airplane. This was a Zero. The fighter that had dominated every air engagement in the Pacific for 6 months straight. The first salvage attempts failed. No heavy equipment. No way to pull a fighter from thick Aleutian mud. But by July 15, a fully equipped team arrived. Lieutenant Robert Kermser led the operation. Machinist's mate Albert Knack and photographer's mate Arthur Borman joined the effort. Knack had the worst job. He had to enter the wreck and cut Koga's body free. The young pilot had been dead for over a month in the Aleutian summer. Knack pulled him out, and they buried him right there on Aleutian Island before hauling the Zero onto a barge and shipping it to Dutch Harbor, then Seattle, then Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, where the real work would begin. The United States Navy knew exactly what they had. An intact enemy fighter. The most feared aircraft in the Pacific. And nobody outside a handful of personnel was going to know about it. Engineers straightened control surfaces. Repaired landing gear and propeller. Replaced torn fabric and damaged fittings. Every piece had to work. Every system had to function. Because this wasn't a museum display. This was an intelligence operation, and the Zero was kept under 24-hour armed guard with absolute secrecy because this was the most valuable piece of enemy hardware captured in the Pacific War, and what happened next would determine whether thousands of American pilots lived or died. On September 20, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Rex Sanders climbed into the cockpit and fired up the engine. The first American test flight of a Zero. The fighter that had dominated Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, and the Java Sea was now flying under the stars and stripes. Sanders and his team flew approximately 24 test flights through mid-October 1942. Every maneuver documented. Every strength and weakness catalogued. Then, on March 5, 1943, the Zero was transferred to Naka Langley for even more rigorous instrumented testing. Sensors. Data recorders. Scientific measurements of every flight characteristic, and what they discovered would save thousands of lives, but it would also reveal something that would fundamentally change how American pilots fought in the Pacific. But here's the question everyone wanted answered. The Zero had terrorized Allied pilots across the Pacific. It seemed unstoppable. So what made it so deadly? And more importantly, did it have weaknesses nobody had discovered? This wasn't academic curiosity. This was life and death. American pilots were dying because they didn't understand their enemy. The Aleutian Zero was about to change that, and what the tests revealed would turn the entire air war upside down. The Zero had outstanding low-speed maneuverability. Its light construction and aerodynamic cleanliness gave it exceptional turn performance. In a slow-speed dogfight, the Zero could turn inside almost anything the Allies had. It also had an extraordinary combat radius. Long range. The ability to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still have fuel to fight and return home. Allied pilots already knew the Zero could turn. They'd learned that the hard way, watching their wingmen get shot down trying to dogfight Zeros at low speed. What the tests revealed were the weaknesses, and these weaknesses would become the foundation for every tactical manual written for the rest of the Pacific War. Weakness number 1. The roll rate and aileron effectiveness fell off at higher speeds. At low speeds, near stall, the Zero had excellent roll and control authority. But as speed increased, the controls got mushy. Aileron effectiveness degraded. The Zero couldn't roll as quickly or reverse direction as rapidly as heavier American fighters at high speed, which meant there was a speed regime where American fighters could outmaneuver it, and that changed everything. Weakness number 2. Vulnerability at high speeds and under high-stress maneuvers. The Zero lacked pilot armor. It had minimal self-sealing fuel tanks. Its light structure meant it couldn't absorb damage. A few well-placed rounds could set it on fire or tear it apart. It also had limited energy retention compared to heavier, armored US fighters. In high-speed dives or sustained climbs, the Zero bled energy faster, which meant American fighters built like tanks could use their weight as an advantage instead of a liability. And then there was weakness number 3. The one that would become infamous and the one that would spark controversy among historians for decades to come. When Allied test pilots pushed the stick forward abruptly, attempting a negative G maneuver, the Zero's engine would quit. This was a massive tactical vulnerability. It meant the Zero couldn't effectively bunt or push into a dive without losing power. American pilots could exploit this by forcing negative G situations, escaping by pushing forward into a dive while the Zero's engine died behind them. Now here's the caveat, and it's an important one that historians still debate. Later technical analysts and researchers pointed out that the negative G issue might have been caused or exacerbated by incorrect carburetor installation during the salvage and restoration process. The Zero had been crashed, flipped upside down, buried in mud for over a month, torn apart, shipped thousands of miles, and reassembled under wartime conditions by American mechanics who had never seen a Zero before. Some components may not have been reinstalled to the original specifications. So the negative G cutoff was observed in this airframe, and American tactics absolutely exploited it. But whether every Zero in Japanese service had this exact problem remains debatable. The captured data was real. The tactical consequences were real. American pilots used this information to survive and win. But the possibility exists that repair mistakes magnified or even created the problem in this specific aircraft, which raises an interesting question about how much of the intelligence advantage came from actual design flaws versus accidental damage that looked like design flaws. Regardless, the combination of measured data from Langley instrumentation reports and pilots' test flights produced a clear picture. The Zero was not invincible. It had exploitable weaknesses. And the United States now knew exactly what they were, but knowing the weaknesses was only half the battle, because you still had to translate technical data from controlled test flights into real-world combat tactics that kept pilots alive when they were pulling GS at 20,000 feet with tracer rounds snapping past their canopy. The tactical directive that came out of the Akutan Zero tests was brutally simple. Avoid low-speed turning duels where the Zero excelled. Do not try to outturn it. You will lose. Instead, US pilots were trained to use boom and zoom tactics. Speed and altitude are your friends. Dive down from above. Use superior speed to close on the Zero. Take your shot. Then climb back to altitude using your energy advantage. Do not stay and dogfight. Hit and run, and the knowledge that Zeros lacked armor and self-sealing tanks also changed engagement philosophy entirely. American pilots were encouraged to use more aggressive head-on attacks. In a head-on pass, the Zero's lack of protection became fatal. The American pilots had armor plating behind their seats. The Japanese pilots had nothing, and this psychological shift alone saved countless lives because pilots stopped being afraid of head-on engagements. Exploit roll and aileron inefficiency at high speed. Fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, which came into service later in the war, had better high-speed roll characteristics. In speed regimes where the Zero's control slackened, American fighters could outmaneuver it. Tactics like the Thatch Weave, already in use, were refined based on the new intelligence. Formations were adjusted. Engagement envelopes were recalculated. The Akutan Zero didn't invent these tactics from scratch. But it validated them. It gave pilots concrete data on when to attempt certain maneuvers and when to disengage. And most importantly, it ended the psychological advantage. The Zero was no longer invincible. It was a machine. With strengths. With weaknesses. And American pilots now had a manual on how to kill it, which brings us to the most persistent and dramatic myth surrounding the Aleutian Zero, the story you've heard 100 times and probably believed until right now. Before we go deeper into this myth and what really won the air war, if you're fascinated by this story of intelligence and the tactics that changed aerial warfare, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. We cover World War II aviation, military history, and untold stories that shaped modern combat every single week. And trust me, what's coming next about the Hellcat will completely change how you see this story. The legend goes like this. The Aleutian Zero was captured, tested, and its secrets were immediately sent to Grumman. Grumman used that intelligence to design the F-6F Hellcat specifically to counter the Zero. The Hellcat went on to dominate the Pacific, racking up a kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese fighters. Therefore, the Aleutian Zero directly created the Hellcat and won the air war. It's a great story. Cause and effect, but there's just one problem. It's oversimplified to the point of being misleading. Here's what is actually true. Data from the Aleutian Zero was forwarded to the Bureau of Aeronautics and to aircraft manufacturers, including Grumman. Engineers absolutely used captured aircraft intelligence as one input among many when refining performance goals, tactics, and design features. The Zero's characteristics influenced American thinking about armor, self-sealing tanks, roll control, and desired power-to-weight ratios. But here's what historians and technical reviewers have established. The Hellcat was already under development before the Aleutian Zero was even discovered. Its performance goals, its heavier engine choices, and its design philosophy were driven by earlier combat experience and engineering decisions that predated the capture by months. The Aleutian Zero helped inform refinements. It validated some design directions Grumman was already pursuing. But it was not the single cause of the Hellcat's design or its success. That's a simplified myth that makes for good storytelling but bad history. The reality is more complex and honestly more interesting. The Hellcat was the product of a larger engineering and tactical response to Japanese air power. Combat reports from the Philippines, from Coral Sea, from early carrier battles all fed into the design process. The Aleutian Zero was one crucial piece of intelligence in a much larger puzzle, and understanding this distinction matters because it reveals what actually won the air war in the Pacific, which most people completely misunderstand. But if the Aleutian Zero didn't single-handedly create the Hellcat, and tactical intelligence alone doesn't win wars, then what actually broke Japanese air superiority? What turned the tide in the Pacific skies? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. All the captured aircraft and tactical refinements in the world wouldn't have mattered without one critical factor. And it had nothing to do with the Zero's weaknesses or American ingenuity or even the Hellcat's design superiority. Here's what nobody talks about. The Aleutian Zero didn't win the air war. American industrial production did. All the intelligence in the world, all the captured aircraft and tactical refinements, all the test flights and data analysis wouldn't have mattered if the United States couldn't build more fighters than Japan could shoot down. The Aleutian Zero shortened the learning curve. It saved lives. It accelerated tactical evolution. But what actually broke Japanese air power was the sheer weight of American production. Thousands of Hellcats. Thousands of Corsairs. Thousands of trained pilots cycling through carrier air groups faster than Japan could replace losses. The Zero remained a capable fighter throughout the war. But by 1944, Japanese pilots were increasingly inexperienced, fuel-starved, and outnumbered 10-1. The Aleutian Zero gave America a tactical edge. But America's factories gave it strategic dominance. Intelligence is valuable. Production is decisive, and this distinction matters because it reveals the real lesson of the Aleutian Zero story that most people miss entirely. The myth says the Aleutian Zero won the air war. The truth is, it helped. Significantly. But victory required everything else too. The industrial capacity to build 12,000 Hellcats. The training infrastructure to produce thousands of pilots. The logistical network to keep those fighters fueled and armed across the vast Pacific. The Aleutian Zero was the scalpel. American industry was the hammer, and you needed both. So what happened to the Aleutian Zero after the war? After it had been tested, studied, flown dozens of times, and had its secrets extracted and disseminated to every fighter squadron in the Pacific, its fate was almost comically anticlimactic. The Zero was transported around the United States for further testing and occasional display. It remained a valuable training and reference aircraft through 1944 and into 1945. Then, in February 1945, at Naval Air Station Anacostia, a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver was taxiing on the ground, and it ran directly into the parked Aleutian Zero. The collision destroyed the aircraft. The most valuable piece of enemy hardware captured in the Pacific War, the intelligence prize that had helped turn the tide of aerial combat, was salvaged for parts and ultimately scrapped. Only small relics survived. Fragments are held today by the National Museum of the U.S. Navy, the Smithsonian, and the Alaska Heritage Museum. And then there's Tadayoshi Koga, the young pilot whose death made all of this possible. Later, the Graves Registration Service exhumed his remains and moved them. Investigations in 1988 and afterward tried to locate his grave and repatriate his remains to Japan. But identification proved uncertain. His remains are likely among the many returned to Japan and reinterred in mass graves or memorial sites. His final resting place is unknown. There's a poignant human cost to this story. A 19-year-old pilot, far from home, was killed in a crash that handed his enemies the keys to defeating his comrades. Koga didn't defect. He didn't surrender. He was just in the wrong place when his aircraft was damaged, and he paid with his life. And what he left behind changed history, not by winning the war single-handedly, but by giving American pilots the knowledge they desperately needed at the exact moment they needed it most. Could a single aircraft, lost and found in the frozen Aleutians, really alter the fate of thousands of lives, or is the true story of the Aleutian Zero really about the people, decisions, and ingenuity that used it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into World War II intelligence and aviation valuable, hit that subscribe button.